morning and welcome to Rising. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving with friends and family, or at the very least with some turkey. Brianna Joy Gray still in transit back to D.C., so instead I am joined by Jessica Burbank, remotely of course. Hello, Jessica. How was your Thanksgiving?
My Thanksgiving was great, Robbie. How was yours?
It was pretty good. I did have to travel on the 2 big travel days, but I didn't have any problems, and I got back to D.C., and I am ready to dive right into the news. What are we talking about today, Jessica?
Well, there's some positive developments to report out of the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. A successful hostage exchange seems to offer the opportunity for a longer ceasefire. The New York Times reported that a third group of 17 hostages, including a 4-year-old American girl whose parents were killed in the Hamas raid on Israel, was freed on Sunday, raising the prospect that more captives could be set free and a fragile truce extended. President Biden took some credit for the temporary pause in hostilities and the release of hostages. Let's take a look.
For weeks, I've been advocating the pause in the fighting for 2 purposes: to increase the assistance getting into the Gaza civilians who need help, and to facilitate release of hostages. And we know that innocent children in Gaza are suffering greatly as well, because this war that Hamas has unleashed has such consequences.
Meanwhile, the White House seems to be struggling internally with how to respond publicly to the conflict. The Washington Post reports that the division inside the White House is to some degree between Biden's senior longtime aides and also an array of younger staffers. Now, many of these younger staffers say the Biden administration hasn't done enough to curb what they see as unjustified violence against the Palestinians. As one commentator put it, Biden has banged Bibi really hard on settler violence and civilian casualties in private. Biden trying is not enough for a simple reason. The U.S. is the superpower, not Israel. The U.S. gives Israel aid and weapons, not the other way around. Biden has the leverage to stop this, and he hasn't. Full stop. So it certainly seems like, regardless of what your own view is on what the U.S. response should be and how they should handle the situation with Israel, young Democrats seem totally furious. They don't find it acceptable how Biden is handling this, and that could end up hurting him. That could end up, frankly, costing him his reelection, given how precarious his reelection seems to be right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Muslim voters overwhelmingly that showed up for Biden in 2020 also not planning on showing up for Biden in 2024. The youth vote was necessary for Biden to win. He relied on it, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be there when he seeks re-election. And this is a big reason why. There's all of this talk from people like Nikki Haley and some of the more conspiratorial conservatives saying, oh, well, it's because TikTok is pushing propaganda, because it's a Chinese app and they want anti-American settlement. It's just not descriptive of what's going on. Young people are much more critical of the U.S.'s actions abroad. They're posting content on TikTok and getting the same warnings and violations that they would get if they talked about any kind of conflict on TikTok, if not more so, talking about the Israel-Palestine war. It's not good content for TikTok to have on because they're an app that runs off of ads. They want to please advertisers. They don't want the content on the app to be all about what's happening in a war abroad in the Middle East. And so really what's going on here is young people have a different way of viewing this. And there's free flow of information on social media. People are learning about the history of the Nakba, that this conflict goes back to 1948. It's not something that started on October 7th. So I think, the youth educating themselves on TikTok, you can say, whatever you want on mainstream or nightly news. The kids aren't going to watch that. They're not going to be influenced by that. What they are influenced by is this new information that they're getting that they haven't received before, that they're not getting in school. And I think that's why Biden's losing the youth vote, is just because they're getting information that doesn't hold up to the propaganda that's being pushed to them.
So I mostly agree with that, with the following caveat. We have seen how much secret internal pressure the American government has placed on U.S. tech companies like X, Twitter under the previous management, Facebook. We've seen the pressure the Canadian government, the pressure the European Union has put on tech companies to engage in censorship and to push narratives and storylines that the government wants. Given that we've seen all that, I think I think I would be totally naive to expect that the Chinese government has no push on TikTok whatsoever, given that China is even more autocratic than the rest of the governments I'm describing and is more closely embedded in the operations of TikTok. So I wouldn't put it past them to influence what you're seeing on TikTok. But that caveat aside, I agree with you that by and large it is just the fact. It's clearly the fact. I can tell from my conversations with you and from watching what other people on the left have to say about this conflict that the very anti-Israel sentiment is not being manufactured. It's clearly genuine. So I think the reason you're right. I think the reason you're seeing a lot of that content do well on TikTok is because that is truly and genuinely the belief of young people. I am critical of that belief. I don't subscribe to it, but I can't ignore that it does exist. And given that that is part of the Democratic contingent coalition, it will certainly impact Biden. I mean, of course, I'm sure some people would say, what if Biden was to do more of what the pro-Palestinian younger left wants, would he lose Jewish voters to the Republican Party, and would that hurt him more than the supporters he's bucking right now? At some point, I guess that becomes like a mathematics game. Really, he wants to try to make everyone happy, and it seems like, frankly, he's making no one happy.
I don't know if he wants to make everyone happy. I mean, you had this deal on the table where Hamas said, in exchange for a ceasefire, we will release hostages. And Israel said no. And then Biden was on camera saying, when he was asked, is there any chance of a ceasefire? None. Absolutely not. And so I don't know if he's been, this neutral party or someone advocating for a pause for some time, like he said. We don't know what's happening behind closed doors. We know what Biden tells us. And we also know that there's been now a leaked list of weapons that the Department of Defense, under Biden's orders, is sending to Israel. They're sending mortars. They're sending 75 tactical vehicles. They're sending bunker busters. They're sending munitions. There's a ton of secret weapons that have been sent to Israel that we wouldn't know about if we didn't have this leaked document from the Department of Defense. This is not normal policymaking from the Biden administration in his handling of Israel. Because when we had the weapons being sent to Ukraine for the U.S.'s support of the war in Ukraine, you had multiple three-page fact sheets of all of the weapons we were sending over. It's not typical for the president of the United States to go behind the backs of Congress and the American people to send weapons to our supposed ally. And I think there's a lot of Jewish people that are protesting now. Again, we had Grand Central Station filled with protesters from Jewish Voice for Peace. So I don't really think that he would lose the Jewish vote. I think there are a lot of Jewish people living in the United States that see what's going on in Israel, and they're extremely critical of it because they see this as something that makes the Jewish people all over the world at risk of more anti-Semitism, of more retaliatory violence because of how violent the Israeli state is being. There were protesters at Netanyahu's house over the weekend. And I think it's time for a lot of people to start criticizing why were children being held in prisons who were Palestinian by Israel for so long? Why were there people who were held, as hostages by the Israeli government for that long to be released in exchange for Hamas hostages? I think when you push such a one-sided story, people become more critical of you when they are on TikTok and they're scrolling, regardless of why it comes up on their feed. But they hear the hostages that were taken by Hamas on October 7th talking about how their treatment was good. And Yocheved Lifshitz was criticized for this when she was released. They said, you're only saying these nice things because your husband is still in there. But now we have another group of hostages, and their stories are emerging. And they're saying, that they got their medications as needed. They were fed as needed. They were allowed to go about their daily activities. They were not treated brutally or humiliated. And so I think what's going on now is people are consuming all of that information and saying, it sounds like my government's actually lying to me, which is worse than if they were just telling both sides of the story. Well, and so I think Biden's making some severe miscalculations and mistakes, and even probably not taking advice from the State Department, considering the lack of congruency between what the State Department is saying and what Biden himself has been saying about a ceasefire and humanitarian pause.
I mean, they were Okay. They were dragged from their homes. They were abducted from a music festival. The people around them were shot. Their family members, some of them, it's children being held when their parents were killed. Look, I'm glad Hamas gave them their medicine, etc. Obviously, Hamas didn't have an interest in the hostages it had under its control dying because it wanted to use them as bargaining chips, and that's good for the hostages, I guess, but they were hostages because the people around them were killed and they were abducted. So I think if young people on TikTok want to romanticize that story, that's up to them. But I think it's like ludicrous to start celebrating the humane treatment here.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about what happens to the Palestinians in the Israeli prisons and the concentration camps that Israeli forces have to push Palestinians out of their home, force them into confined locations in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in the Israeli prisons, where they have many Palestinians that have been there for over a decade. I think that when we compare those two things and we compare the kind of ethnic cleansing that Israel is doing to the Palestinians, it doesn't really compare at all. I mean, what Israel's doing and the amount of Palestinians that they've taken, who are children, who are innocent civilians, it's a much greater number than the amount of hostages that Hamas has of Israelis. And a big reason for that is because Israel is backed by the military might of the United States. And I think that's another reason young people are so critical, because they don't want to see their tax dollars supporting atrocities. And so when we think about 2018, when we think about the fact that children who are in Palestine, who are 16, 17, 15 years old, they've lived through 4 wars already. They have been deprived of food and water many times over. They have watched other civilians die many times over. Hamas is mostly comprised of orphans because their family has been killed by Israel as they slowly push Palestinians out of their land and continue to kill Palestinians. Now we have the death toll 20,000 exceeding the Nakba. We had the Nakba in 1948, which Israel identifies as their time of independence, but it's called the Nakba, which means the great crisis, the great conflict, the terrible thing in Arabic. And this was the time when Israel decided to establish a state and push Palestinians out of their lands. They displaced 750,000 people and killed 15,000. Now we have the death toll exceeding 20,000, and we have the amount of Palestinians displaced, 1.7 million. So the U.S. supporting this, I think, is why people are so critical. They see the hostage taking as some kind of retaliation for decades and decades of such cruel treatment of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not sitting here, defending what Israel has done by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I've been very critical of it. I just see a difference between, I think one can be and should be critical, especially of the American, funding of just other governments in general without asking any questions, which doesn't make America safer. I think it's important to be critical of that while still being clear-eyed about the reality of Hamas. But that's why we have the discussion on the show, and we'll have more Rising right after this.